Good day, everybody. It's been a very long time since I did a voice intro, but I don't think you'll have missed my pretty annoying voice. My narrations are the lowest viewed videos on my channel, but screw the algorithm, am I right? Anyways, today I will be narrating the prologue of my Songs of War fanfiction, Retroactive Revision. It's honestly so far from the original Songs of War canon that it's barely a fanfiction, but hey, I've had fun writing it. All the original materials are linked in the description, including a link to the original Songs of War movie, Plasmatropolis, and Retroactive Revision itself. On with the video, and do enjoy. The light of a flickering street lamp illuminated the far-off warehouse, squat and sprawling, a monolith on the black horizon. A slowly thinning forest covered Plasmatropolis outlands like the fuzz on a baby bird, severed stumps filling the voids between them. The trees were the only thing that concealed the building of horrors, and even they were giving way under the withering aura of the Sindara's headquarters. The abandoned and repurposed military base was less than welcoming. A sun-bleached tin roof haphazardly slapped onto the top of the structure, corrugated steel walls and fences painted with a sad, muted blue, already chipping along the edges. A roughly scratched and painted insignia carved into a heavy metal gate was the only sign of inhabitation, the night silent and unassuming. That silence broke, however, as tires skidded along the ground, gravel crunching beneath the rolling rubber. Lamplight reflected off the black van, traveling down the worn trail to the building ahead. Deep and hollow heartbeats filled the passengers' ears, pounding against their throats. The patient, their leader, was splayed out in the back seat of the van. A Sindaris with dark blue markings gripped the wheel tighter, knuckles whitening as another wave of urgency swept through him. The driver was unsure in his turns, inexperienced, the length of his horns betraying his youth. His breathing was choppy, a result of an illness he contracted many long years ago. Unsteady sobbing could be heard from the passenger's seat, the Voltaris beside him struggling to stay composed. The adrenaline he'd had from the fight must have been wearing off, and the severity of their situation was settling in. Silence returned to the air as the van rolled off the gravel and onto the dirt. "I know what you're going to ask," the driver muttered, not entirely unkindly. "I'm going as fast as I can." A quiet whisper was his only response. "Why did it have to go so long?" Another silence. "I'd already warned him that going after an affiliate of Black Plasma would have been a bad idea." He paused for a moment, considering if the opinion he was about to share was wise. It was his own doing. The Voltaris turned away, seeming to have a realization. "If I hadn't killed that girl, Alias wouldn't have gotten hurt." "Tigran, calm down. Things happen. Focus on breathing. We'll get him home soon." The Voltaris, Tigran, looked doubtful, but was silent again. He struggled to form another sentence, then gave up, sinking into his seat, twiddling his thumbs with bloody hands. The Voltaris tried to hug himself, but he ended up looking like he was clutching at his stomach, as if he were ill and were trying not to throw up. "Wirius, could I ask you for something?" The red-marked Ardoni glanced over at the back seat for a split second. "Please don't let him die." The driver, Wirius, paused. In a quiet and sympathetic voice, he said, "I'm sorry, sir, but I can't make any promises." His vision momentarily went dark before flickering back in starburst patterns. He gasped, slamming the brakes. Wirius felt something in his chest break. "Tigran, take the wheel." There were no more words as the force that allowed him to breathe gave way. He slumped forward, dead in an instant. Tigran hopped from one leg to another, shuffling worriedly, pacing the room with measured steps. In a quiet and breathy voice, he counted. 451, 452, 453. He looked up. "Caesientris, will he be alright?" The Voltaris' voice was almost childlike in manner, and the doctor curled his lip in annoyance. This Voltaris always, somehow, seemed to be standing right where it was least convenient. Ciantrus was glad the other could not see the disdainful sneer underneath his blue surgical mask. The Sindaris shifted his weight slightly, readjusting his grip on his clipboard as he did so, blue pen in hand. He looked away from his patient to glare at the visitor. Yes, if you stop bothering him and me like that. The red-marked Ardoni gaped at him. I just watched Weary's die in front of me. Would you at least pretend to console me? Not the kind of person to lie in order to make you feel better. The Sindaris looked back down at his notes, quickly scribbling down another line into the report file. He shot Tigran a warning glance as he noticed him opening his mouth to speak up, but the Voltaris didn't appear to notice. Ciantrus privately jeered. The Voltaris hesitated a moment, then started again. Why hasn't he woken up yet? Why do you have so many fucking questions? He snapped back, cutting the other Ardoni off mid-sentence. He rarely spoke back to his patient's loved ones, but this individual just happened to be particularly awful and insufferable. He would never understand why the Sindaris master would choose this particular Ardoni as his partner for life. He sighed, switching to a more professional tone. In case you didn't notice, he has 2 large lacerations on his chest, one of them inflicted by a regular steel blade, the other of Draug origin. He made a half-hearted attempt to keep his voice level, as there was a very obvious undertone of hostility. The second blow has caused blisters to form. The first made a wound deeper than any I've seen short of amputation. He has suffered from great blood loss and stress from utilizing mobility flash. I'm surprised he's still alive. As he mentioned the song's name, he pointed at it with a gloved thumb, its golden core spinning and pulsing with a quiet music, ringing in the room in tune with the buzz of an old ventilator. He's alive because he's strong! Tigran cried. Shh! Ciantrus hissed back. The Voltaris closed his mouth and turned away from the doctor, looking down at the floor with a hint of guilt on his face. The show didn't last for long though, and he looked up at the master lying on the stretcher, staring at the mound of linen bound around the man's chest. After a few more moments of silence between the two, filled only by the humming of the ventilator in the mobilium, the Voltaris looked up, red eyes carefully shying away from the Sindaris' pale blue ones. He appeared to be holding back a pointed retort. Thank you for helping, Thaddeus. I don't know what I'd do if he was gone. Tigran's words did not sound entirely sincere. You'd go back to your life, the one you had before you decided to moon after my boss. The Sindaris spat back, not even pausing to consider his words. Now, rip your head out of your ass and go away. Go past Avatros or Iralian if you absolutely have to talk to someone. I have shit to get done. His goal was to get underneath Tigran's skin, and he was pretty sure he'd succeeded. Rage and disbelief began to fill the other's eyes, but he quickly turned away, storming out of the room. The Voltaris pulled the door to the unit open and slammed it shut, the wall shaking a little as it was forcefully put back into its frame. Loud footsteps could be heard receding from the other side of the wooden barrier, charged with fury. Ciantrus guessed he was returning to his on-site sleeping quarters. Perfect. Right where he needed him. Examining the corpse closely, Avatros felt himself clench his fist. One side of Weirius' chest had been caved in, and his markings were so black he almost didn't recognize him as Sindaris. A pneumothorax and broken ribs were probably the cause of death, he concluded, based on previous records. Ciantrus' lab coat hung loosely over his shoulders, covering his hands and dropping down past his knees. He shivered a little under the fabric. He'd spoken to Wirius only 2 days ago, and to know he'd simply dropped dead mere yards in front of the military base unnerved him. He and Duralian had been tasked with resuscitating him, and he really did try to. He'd done chest compressions until his arms ached and burned, until his fingertips went numb. He hadn't stopped even when he heard the crack of the dead man's rib, but deep down he knew he was a lost cause. There'd been too much time between getting him here and starting the compressions. Trying to convince himself it wasn't his fault, Avatros reminded himself that Wirius' lung condition was already killing him. He was still young, barely an adult, but Avatros doubted the boy had any longer to live. Duralian walked over, picking up on his regret and placing a hand on his shoulder. "You did your best, Worthless. Maybe he would have lived if I'd given him a dose of potion of healing before the mission," he said, wishing he'd thought of it earlier. "Lexia probably would have had your head if he even tried to take his precious potions," the Kiltaris Sindaris joked. Avatros let out a sigh of acknowledgement, knowing that was exactly what Sientris most likely would have done, even if he was the doctor's assistant and thus had some extra privileges. It was a reasonable reaction though, as Sientris didn't especially like wasting his resources on anything but what he wanted. "I might check in on Sientris before his shift ends," Avatros declared. "I have to return his lab coat anyway, and he'll be off soon." "Yeah, you do that. I'll get Wirius buried in the meantime," she said, dragging a thin sheet of cloth over the face of the corpse. Avatros left the room while Aurelian was taking care of things, a hollow chasm carving itself into a wall within his chest, as if trying to cave it in just as Wirius's had. He didn't know why he felt as if there was something he could have done to save the boy's life, as if it was someone's fault he died. He shrugged, feeling the lab coat shift, and thought about his owner. It was Sientris, wasn't it? Slicing, cutting, and hissing, spitting blood and staining sheets. Death. Oaths broken. Assignments completed, leaving all empty inside. He hated him. The doctor felt his grip on the scalpel tighten, tears brimming his eyes as he held back the urge to stab the Voltaris over and over and over again. He had to make it look like an accident, a tragedy. But he hated him so much. He stared at the barely glowing blood that trickled from the minuscule cut in his neck, the reddish light decaying into darkness. He couldn't stop looking at it. He'd done it, and he'd done it out of malice. He could have held back, but Simeon had pushed him over the edge. After all, they both hated that dead Voltaris. "What do you mean he's dead?" Thalius yelled with a fury only hampered by the wounds on his chest, tears building in his eyes. The doctor relaxed his face into a more neutral expression, attempting to look sympathetic. The master had just been taken off the ventilator. He was healing quickly. Sientris looked up as he finished fixing the IV needle in the crook of Thalius's left elbow. "Answer me honestly. What do you fucking mean he's dead?" "Sir," he began, his words cold and practical. "You have just woken up. You mustn't stress yourself out like this. I don't have enough blood for a second transfusion." Thalius' teeth bared into a snarl, such indescribable pain and rage and grief filling his voice as he started yelling again. "You'll never understand how I feel now!" The master threw his head back, sinking back into his pillow with a sob. His voice cracked as he spoke up again. "I don't care if I die. If Tychon's already dead, then what do I have to live for?" The doctor took a step back, close to the door, suddenly regretting his method of assassination. you committed suicide 2 days ago, he did not believe you would wake up. You would never. He has. The pale blue Sindaris looked down at the ground, feeling his throat dry up. You have my deepest condolences, sir. The man I've loved for years beyond counting has just died. Is that all your pathetic, stuck-up, professional mind can muster? The master's chest heaved as he coughed loudly, spitting out a spray of blood. More blood began soaking the bandages once more. Small, luminescent blue dots growing larger, stark, against the linen. His turquoise markings flickered briefly before resuming their usual illumination. Falling back onto the pillow, he whispered to the other Sindaris. Please just let me die too. I can't do that. I'm a doctor. His voice hitched slightly. I save lives. Thalia sat up, suddenly and without warning. Ciantris hopped backwards out of surprise, then rushed forward to support the swaying Sindaris. Jamming his shoulder underneath the other's armpit, he held the master in place. Internally, he cringed. He despised being this close to anyone. The heat of a fading fever radiated from the cracking and dried skin, and the doctor had never been so glad to be wearing a mask at that moment. When Thalius had settled down, he slithered away from under his armpit. You must rest. Don't tell me what to do, Lexia! I need to see Tiger for myself! His body was buried in a clearing in the forest. Ciantris explained in a stern, matter-of-fact voice. Kai Thalius, I will warn you exactly once. Any injury you receive on this venture will most likely not be treatable. You either stay here, or you join Tiger. The master glared at him, a glare so filled with venom and hate it may as well have been a potion of harm. If looks could kill. He simply blinked at the other Sindaris. Are you about to go or not? No. Good. Ciantris turned away, rubbing hand sanitizer onto his hands. You're still reasonable. Perhaps the rest of your brain will recover in time. And maybe your liver too. Under his breath, he added, alcoholic. He did not pause to listen to the man's response, simply closing the door behind him and walking off. Sometimes he wished he had an easier job, but he had what he had, and backing out now just wasn't an option. Because backing out meant giving up.